March 1, 1945, Salzburg Rail Yards, Austria, the last train out. The floor of the cattle car was still wet with something that smelled like blood and urine, but it was warmer than the air outside. Galina wrapped her arms tighter around her baby's torso, his legs dangling stiff from cold. The boy hadn't cried since yesterday, just small, wet coughs. Frost had crept up the inside of the window slats. Beside her, old Andrei clutched an Orthodox cross and kept whispering a prayer, not for salvation, but that the Americans wouldn't bomb the train. Again. They'd seen it 2 days earlier, smoke columns twisting into the winter sky, Allied P-47s diving like thunderbirds, blowing apart trains full of fleeing SS officers and looted art. The guards in their car, 2 teens and a gray-haired corporal, had abandoned the train hours ago when whispers of the Americans crossing the Inn River reached the station master. The front was gone, collapsed. No one knew who was in charge anymore. Galina lifted her head and blinked through the fog. The train had stopped. She didn't hear gunfire, not the bark of German orders. Only boots crunching over gravel and, strangely, laughter. Not the guttural kind, not the sneer of guards mocking prisoners. It was warm, open, laughing like someone had just told a joke. Then came the clank of steel against wood. Sunlight exploded into the railcar as the door was wrenched open. For a second, Galina thought it was more German troops, big men in dark coats, rifles slung. One had a cigarette dangling from his lips and a patch on his sleeve she didn't recognize, a white star. The Americans had arrived. But instead of shouts or guns, the first thing they handed into the car wasn't orders. It was a loaf of white bread, steam still rising off the crust. Then another man tossed in a thick army blanket, brown and coarse, but warmer than anything they'd had in weeks. The third man stepped forward and said in a slow, practiced Russian, "We came for you, you're free now." That was when Andrei dropped his cross, and Galina started to cry. In the days that followed, more than 700 Russian refugees, some political exiles, some escaped forced laborers, others just children who had run east and ended up west, were herded not into camps but into a converted Red Cross center just south of Salzburg. It had heating, latrines, soup. Some of them didn't believe it. Anatoly Sidorov, once a university instructor from Kharkov, watched through frost-lined windows as a convoy of 6 U.S. Army trucks pulled into the courtyard. He counted them out loud. 6 GMC CCKWs, each loaded with boxes marked relief supplies. There were blankets, yes, but also condensed milk, sacks of flour, tins of Spam, and for the children, crates of chocolate and something called chewing gum. "No one gives away this much," he muttered, "not without wanting something back." "Maybe they want us to fight," said another man, fingers tapping his soup tin like a metronome. "Or they'll trade us to Stalin." But what came next upended even those grim expectations. 2 soldiers in olive drab unloaded not rifles but a projector. An American officer set up a white sheet across one wall of the main dining hall. The room dimmed. The bulb flickered to life. And there, in black and white, Fred Astaire began to dance. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't even a message. It was laughter, light, ridiculous, impossible laughter in a room full of war-weary men and bone-thin children who hadn't seen a moving picture since before the Reich swallowed their countries. A little girl laughed so hard she spilled her soup. For most, that was the moment the spell cracked, not because the Americans had brought food or heat, but because they had brought joy, unasked, unattached, as if it was a normal thing to do, as if it was human again to smile. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread like wildfire that American soldiers were teaching Russian teenagers how to play baseball, that the army chaplain had baptized 2 babies without asking for papers, that an old woman had received new shoes from a black soldier who smiled at her in perfect Russian. Galina couldn't believe the most absurd one of all, that the GIs were risking reprimands to sneak extra loaves of bread into the women's dormitory. Then one night she found it. A soft thump at the door. She opened it, no one there. Only a brown sack steaming with fresh rolls. Pinned to it was a note scrawled in broken Cyrillic. "You are not forgotten." She clutched the bread and sank to the floor. That night, for the first time in months, her son didn't cough. But not everyone believed it would last. Sergeant Mikhail Artyomovich, a Red Army soldier who deserted in '43 after his unit was annihilated near Kursk, had kept his pistol buried inside a hollowed book spine. He watched the American officers with slit eyes. One day they would leave, or worse, turn them all over to the NKVD, who were said to be already moving west with the Red Army. One afternoon, a U.S. colonel entered the refugee center's meeting hall. He brought translators, 3 crates of wool socks, and something even stranger, a jazz band. The colonel took the stage and spoke with calm precision. "This is not a prison. No guards, no fences, no barbed wire. You are free to stay or to leave. If you need help going somewhere safe, we will help you." Mikhail nearly laughed. No one offered help in Europe anymore, not unless they wanted a name or a favor or your soul. But the jazz band began to play, and something changed in the room. Not everyone danced, but they didn't leave either. They watched, they listened. One man tapped his foot, a boy clapped off beat, and before the song was over, Mikhail found himself nodding along. Then the colonel stepped down, and without ceremony, poured himself a cup of the same watery broth everyone else had been served. No silver cutlery, no separate table, just a folding chair and a chipped ceramic mug. Galina stared at him from across the room. "He could be anywhere," she whispered, "but he's here." Andrei replied softly, "That's what they don't understand in Moscow. The Americans didn't win because of tanks. They won because they share bread, and blankets, and laughter." The wind off the mountain still bit like knives, but inside the camp, someone had painted the hallway doors with bright red numbers. Children had started playing a game with them, tapping on the painted digits and pretending they were secret codes to hidden rooms. It was the first time in a long while that any of them had laughed without glancing over their shoulders. Anatoly Sidorov, the former professor, sat at the corner table near the fireplace, scribbling in a notebook with one of the pencils the Americans had handed out in a box labeled "School Supplies for Displaced Children." The irony hadn't escaped him. Only weeks ago, that same label would have meant something more sinister in Nazi territory. He watched as Private Earl Simmons, a 22-year-old from Alabama with a slow drawl and faster grin, fumbled his way through a conversation with a 10-year-old girl in Ukrainian. She was teaching him the word for butterfly and kept giggling whenever he mispronounced it. "Butterfly," Simmons tried again, eyebrows raised. The girl shook her head, mimed wings with her arms, then touched her chest. "Motilek," she repeated slowly. "Motilek," he echoed, finally getting it close enough. She beamed and clapped her hands. Anatoly closed his notebook. There was something almost unbearable about watching someone who had never tasted war pretend, for the sake of a child, that the world was still whole. Later that afternoon, he found Simmons leaning against the edge of the rec hall, staring out at the snow-dusted tree line. Anatoly lit a cigarette and offered one to the GI. Simmons took it without a word. "Why are you here?" Anatoly asked bluntly. The soldier shrugged. "Orders, I guess." "That's not what I mean. You're not just feeding us. You're trying, you joke, you listen. You brought records and a piano. Why?" Simmons exhaled smoke, his eyes narrowed. "My grandma used to say the worst thing war takes from a man is not his home or his kin. It's the part that knows how to be kind. I figure, maybe if we keep doing small kind things, that part don't die." Anatoly stared at him for a long moment. "Your grandmother sounds like a philosopher." "She ran a pie shop," Simmons said and grinned. 3 nights later, the Americans hosted what they called a potluck. Galina had no idea what the word meant until soldiers began showing up carrying trays of food not from army kitchens, but from their own rations, supplemented by what they'd traded with locals. There was sweet cornbread, something called casserole, and small tins of condensed fruit. But what made the hall fall silent was when a black GI named Corporal Curtis Jefferson stood up with a fiddle and began to play a melody so aching, so full of old soil and sorrow and hope, that Galina forgot to breathe. The notes hung in the rafters like the scent of baking bread. Then someone started tapping a fork on the table in time. Another man clapped, and before long the hall was alive again, not with war stories, not with orders, but with music. That night Galina's boy laughed again, a deep belly laugh that made her hand fly to her mouth. He'd been so silent for weeks. She turned to Anatoly, who simply whispered, "It's working." But the outside world was catching up. On March 14th, a courier arrived. His uniform was British, but his briefcase was stamped with the seal of the Allied Control Council. He met privately with the U.S. officers, and for hours the mood inside the camp shifted. Smiles tightened, postures stiffened. Something had changed. The next morning, Colonel Franklin gathered the refugees in the courtyard. His Russian translator, a woman named Irina who had once been a theater actress in Minsk, stood beside him. "I need to be honest," he began. "The war is nearly over. Germany is collapsing. But that means old borders are returning, and so are governments." A murmur passed through the crowd. "For some of you, this is good news. For others, I understand it may not be. The Soviet Union has requested repatriation of all displaced Soviet citizens. All, that includes you." Gasps, a woman sobbed. Colonel Franklin held up a hand. "But we do not force anyone. Not here. If you wish to return to Soviet territory, we will make arrangements. If you fear for your life or safety upon return, we will work to place you elsewhere. It may take time, but no one here will be handed over against their will." Silence. Then Mikhail stepped forward. He had shaved that morning, stood tall in a borrowed coat, but in his eyes was the same fire that had once burned in the steppes. "If we go back," he said, his voice low and sure, "we will vanish. No courts, no trials, just trains again, this time east." Colonel Franklin nodded. "We know." And that was the first time the refugees realized what the Americans were risking. By refusing to hand them over, these soldiers were defying not just orders, but Stalin himself. The repercussions began almost immediately. First came the bureaucrats, men with clipped accents and folders thick with names. They arrived under diplomatic status, bearing Soviet flags on their lapels. One approached Galina directly. "You are from Rostov. Your husband was an officer. The USSR wants you home." She stared at him. "My husband is dead." "You have a child." "I have a life now," she said. "A warm room, a blanket, a name." "You are Russian," the man said. "That life belongs to Moscow." But it didn't. And when the Americans blocked him from entering the dormitory later that night, the man left with a sneer. "They cannot protect you forever." Anatoly began documenting everything. Every time the Americans shared food, every time a refugee was offered a choice, not a command. He wrote letters to newspapers, to embassies, to anyone who might listen. He called it the Salzburg Diary. One night, Simmons saw him scribbling by lantern light and asked what he was writing. "Truth," Anatoly said, "the kind no one will believe later, that in the middle of a continent drowning in death, someone gave away bread." Simmons thought for a moment, then handed him a folded paper. It was a photograph, black and white, fuzzy but unmistakable. Galina holding her son. Behind her, a U.S. soldier kneeling to tie the boy's shoelaces. "I thought maybe you want to include that," Simmons said. Anatoly nodded and tucked it into the diary. By April, the camp was changing again. A shipment of paint arrived. Refugees were allowed to decorate the walls. One woman painted a mural of a tree in bloom, another stitched quilts for the children. The Americans organized classes in English, mathematics, even music. And every Sunday, no matter the weather, Colonel Franklin walked among them without escort, carrying a tin mug and asking people how they were sleeping. He knew the Soviet pressure was mounting, knew the Allies were negotiating hard compromises, but he held the line. Not one name, he told his officers. They want names they can come and ask to each face, to each soul. And still he smiled. Still they gave blankets. Still they shared laughter. But nothing lasts forever. On April 18th, a convoy of black cars pulled up to the camp gates. Inside were men not in Soviet uniforms but in UNRRA suits, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. They had orders, lists. The camp was to be shut down in 6 weeks. The American military would reassign the facility. All refugees must be relocated, repatriated, or processed by international authorities. Galina's heart sank. Anatoly cursed under his breath. But the Americans didn't abandon them. They fought. Colonel Franklin filed injunctions. He wrote letters to command. He even called in favors from the Red Cross. Meanwhile, his soldiers helped build what they called exit paths, pathways to other lives. Some refugees were moved to American-occupied Italy. Others were quietly transferred to British protection zones. A few, incredibly, were given visas to Canada. And for those with nowhere to go, Colonel Franklin made a promise. You will not go back in chains. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The bells rang in Salzburg. Fireworks lit the night sky. Inside the camp there was no celebration, only stillness. Galina sat with her son, wrapped in a quilt made by a Polish woman who had once been a tailor in Krakow. Simmons brought them each a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. It's sweet, Galina said, blinking. First one's always a shock, Simmons grinned. Her son clinked his bottle against hers like a toast. To what? She asked softly. Simmons paused, then said, to a world where kindness doesn't need a reason. By June, the days had grown longer, and the alpine winds had softened into breezes that carried the scent of pine and warming earth. But within the Salzburg Refugee Center, a different kind of tension crept through the halls, quiet and invisible, like the shadow of a coming storm. The end of the war hadn't brought peace. Not really. Not to people like Galina. Not to Anatoly or Mikhail or the scores of refugees who now existed in a limbo between the world they'd fled and the one that didn't yet want them. And outside the walls, the lines were hardening. The Americans still offered bread and warmth, but now their faces looked more tired. Meetings grew longer. Supplies came slower. Some of the GIs were being reassigned. Even Simmons had mentioned that his company might be rotated to Munich soon. The real war was over. The new one, the quiet one, was beginning. It started with a list. Anatoly was in the administration building when he overheard 2 U.S. officers arguing. We can't just hand them over, Bill. You know damn well half those names are already dead or missing. The Soviets are inflating numbers to round up dissidents. I'm not arguing that, but the directive is clear. Allied agreement. Yalta. We send back anyone they claim. Anatoly stepped into the hallway, heart thundering. Later that night, he found Colonel Franklin in the rec hall, sleeves rolled up, sorting ration slips with the chaplain. They have a list, Anatoly said, voice low. The colonel didn't look up. I know. And I'm doing everything I can. You don't understand, Anatoly hissed. They won't just take us. They'll make an example of us. If they get one, just one, they'll say it proves every refugee here is a criminal or a deserter. It'll open the floodgates. Franklin stood then slowly. Professor, I've read the reports. I've seen what happens to people who return east. That's why I've been lying through my teeth to every bureaucrat who's come through that door for the past 3 weeks. He ran a hand over his face. But I can't stop the train that's coming, not alone. Anatoly was silent for a long moment. Then we help you lie better. The next morning, the camp came alive with controlled chaos. Every adult who could read or write was pulled into the effort. They cross-checked names, created new identities, forged old ones. Children were reassigned to aunts and uncles. Birthplaces were rewritten from Kharkov to Krakow, from Minsk to the ruins of Warsaw. Galina watched as one of the American medics helped her fill out a form declaring her a stateless person of Polish origin. She was neither, but the Soviet Union hadn't claimed the Poles, yet. The medic winked as he stamped it with a forged seal. You'll be someone new by morning. And for the first time in her life, Galina felt the cold relief of being a nobody. But the list still existed. 3 days later, a convoy of trucks bearing Soviet flags rolled into Salzburg. The men who emerged wore NKVD trench coats and carried no smiles. They marched into the camp with a British escort, demanding access to their nationals. Colonel Franklin met them in the courtyard, firm, calm. Any person claiming Soviet citizenship has been advised of their right to return. None have voluntarily accepted repatriation at this time. One of the Soviets spat at his feet. Then we will speak to them ourselves. Franklin shook his head. This is American jurisdiction. You may submit names, but contact with individuals must be mediated and approved. We're not running a zoo. There was a standoff for hours. Mikkel watched it all from the rooftop of the West Dormitory. Eyes narrowed, hands clenched around a pair of binoculars he'd bartered from an American mechanic. You know, he said to Anatoly beside him, they're not going to stop. They'll just wait for nightfall, or bribe someone, or pull a trick. Anatoly sighed, then we must be ready. And that night they began the drills. It wasn't military training, not exactly, but it had a rhythm. Children were taught what to say if asked about their parents. Women were shown hidden paths behind the dormitories, should they need to slip away during a sweep. The Americans posted extra guards, not soldiers but volunteers, at all entrances. Private Simmons, now one of the few original GIs still posted there, stood at the back fence with a thermos of coffee and a baseball bat. Figured I'd make myself useful, he said with a grin. But it wasn't a joke. Not anymore. Then one night they came. Not in full uniform, not with tanks or loudspeakers, just 2 men in gray coats and a quiet black car, slipping past the outer gate during a shift change. They went straight for Barracks 12, the women's wing. Somehow they had names, knew which bed, which room. But they hadn't counted on Galina. She was coming back from the latrines when she saw them, tall shadows creeping toward the side entrance. One carried a flashlight, the other something heavier. She didn't think, she ran. Banged on the nearest door, shouted in Russian. Within seconds the hallway erupted, children crying, women yelling, a pot clattering to the ground. The 2 intruders froze. Then one shouted something in Polish, trying to pass as an escort. But it was too late. Mikkel rounded the corner with 4 other men, all armed with nothing but sticks and fists. Behind them came Simmons, baseball bat raised, face grim. The Soviets turned and fled, out the door, over the low fence into the night. Colonel Franklin arrived 5 minutes later, assessed the damage, took statements. Then, without fanfare, he ordered that all Soviet delegations be banned from the premises until further notice. If they want to file a protest, he said, they can do it through Geneva. In the weeks that followed, life resumed, warped but not broken. Children returned to their games. The soup lines reappeared. Simmons organized a baseball game between American soldiers and teenage refugees. They played with mismatched gloves, a half-deflated ball, and bases drawn in chalk. Galina's son hit a grounder past second and tripped on the way to third. He got up laughing. Anatoly cheered so hard he lost his voice. That night he handed Simmons a package. "What's this?" the GI asked. "A copy," Anatoly said, "of the diary, the whole thing. I've arranged for a copy to go to London and one to the New York Times, but I want you to have one too." Simmons opened the cover. Inside was a photo of the refugee camp, scribbled beneath it in Russian and English. "They tried to bury us in silence, but someone shared bread and laughter, and now we live." Simmons didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "You're gonna make a hell of a professor, Doc." "I already was," Anatoly said. "Now I'm something else, maybe a witness." By July, the Salzburg Refugee Center was shutting down. The war had ended. The world was moving on. The Americans had new orders. Some of the refugees were granted new homes, temporary lodgings in France, Belgium, Italy. A few were accepted into immigration programs in Canada or the U.S. Galina was offered a placement with a Quaker relief group in southern France. Anatoly received an academic posting in Switzerland, under a false name, but real papers. Mikkel chose to stay in Austria. He'd met a widow. They had plans to grow potatoes. But on the final night, July 28th, the Americans held one last gathering. They called it the Farewell Supper. There was food, music, a banner drawn by the children in shaky English, "Thank you for our new start." Colonel Franklin made no speeches. He just stood at the back, drink in hand, watching. Simmons played a record, Louis Armstrong. And one by one, the refugees approached the Americans. They didn't say much. Some gave small tokens, embroidered cloths, a carved pipe, a poem. Galina handed Simmons a photo. It was of him, crouched beside her son, tying his shoe. She said only, "So he never forgets what kindness looks like." The camp closed at dawn. Trucks rolled out. Flags came down. The American soldiers were gone by noon. But for the rest of their lives, every refugee who passed through that camp carried something the war couldn't destroy. The memory of a place where, for a few short months, in the ruins of a continent shattered by cruelty, someone had handed them bread, wrapped them in a blanket, and made them laugh again. By late summer 1945, the barbed wire was gone. The painted numbers on the dorm doors had been scrubbed clean. The scent of disinfectant and chalk replaced the sour fog of war. The Salzburg Refugee Center was now empty. Doors creaked open to echoing silence, dormitories stripped bare, fire pits cold. But outside, scattered across Europe, the legacy of those months, of the Americans who had defied orders with kindness, and the refugees who had refused to disappear, was just beginning to ripple. In Lyon, France, Galina found herself living in a small stone house alongside 6 other women and a British nurse named Alice. Her son had grown stronger. He spoke 3 languages now, Russian, a bit of English, and the fast, bubbly French of the neighborhood children. His laugh came easier. His eyes no longer darted toward doorways. One crisp morning, Galina walked past a bakery and stopped dead in her tracks. The smell, yeast, butter, fresh dough, slammed into her like a wave. She blinked. Her chest tightened. The first loaf of American white bread, Simmons's voice, "You are not forgotten." She turned away quickly, but not before the baker, a wiry man in flour-dusted suspenders, caught her expression. He stepped out with a wrapped roll. "You look like someone who could use this," he said in slow, gentle French. Galina didn't speak the language well, but some things needed no translation. She bowed slightly, took the roll, bit into it, and smiled. Meanwhile, in Lausanne, Switzerland, Anatoly stood before a lecture hall of skeptical graduate students. He was now Professor Anton Weiss, an alias arranged with the help of the Quakers, and 3 forged birth certificates. The lecture was supposed to be about post-war dislocation, but halfway through, a student asked, "What do you believe actually prevented Europe from collapsing completely into chaos after 1945? Anatoly looked at the blackboard, at the rows of blank-eyed 20-somethings, and then back down at the diary he still kept with him. He didn't mention military operations, or Marshall plans, or policy. Autumn always came late to the foothills of Salzburg, like a polite visitor hesitant to interrupt the final warmth of summer. By the time the leaves turned and the wind picked up again, the old refugee center had long since been paved over, rebuilt, and renamed. Children ran barefoot across schoolyard blacktop where once men stood starving. Laughter still echoed through the air, but the war it had once defied was now just a chapter in textbooks, flattened, distant, almost fictional. But for those who had lived through it, for the refugees who had been seen, touched, fed, warmed, and protected by strangers wearing olive drab and foreign smiles, the memory remained as sharp and visceral as the sound of boots on gravel at midnight. Galina never forgot the sound of the sliding train door creaking open. She never forgot the face of the soldier who handed her bread. In 2003, Galina's son, now a father himself, stood at a podium at a small university in Canada, where he'd been invited to speak about Cold War displacement and refugee history. The professor who introduced him mentioned his background only briefly. Born in post-war Europe, emigrated to Canada with his mother in 1948, educated in Montreal. He walked up, placed a worn book on the lectern, and paused for several seconds before speaking. "This," he said, tapping the book, "was my bedtime story." He held up Anatoly's diary. No dragons, no princes, just people, a woman, a soldier, a piece of bread. He told them about the winter of 1945, about the Americans who brought music, about Private Simmons and the first taste of Coca-Cola, about the fear and the warmth and the silence when it finally lifted. When he finished, a student asked, "Do you remember any of it yourself?" He smiled, "Only in feelings, the cold on my cheeks, the heaviness in my mother's arms, the sound of typewriter keys, but everything else, everything I know, I carry because someone wrote it down, and because someone else didn't look away when we were starving." He picked up the diary again. This book isn't about refugees, it's about refusal. Refusal to be indifferent, refusal to surrender kindness to bureaucracy. It's about people who had every right to close the door, opening it instead. Meanwhile, the U.S. National Archives had digitized hundreds of field reports from Allied relief operations during the closing months of World War II. In one such report, buried in a routine logistics memo, was an entry from Colonel Franklin. Morale remained stable, supplies adequate, civilian coordination improving. Note, today we received a piano, donated by a local Austrian family who heard the children singing. They said the Americans reminded them that music could still exist here. We'll put it in the rec hall. I've assigned Private Simmons to make sure the kids don't break it on day one. They probably will. That's all right. Let them be loud. Anatoly's diary. No one came for us, until they did, saw a resurgence in the 2010s, as refugee crises once again filled headlines. A paperback reprint came with a new foreword, written by a young historian who had discovered the book while researching U.S. Army humanitarian operations. She ended her introduction with a line that echoed across decades. In a world where orders demanded silence, they chose to sing. And still the stories rippled. In Alabama, a middle school was renamed in 2016. The community, once divided about the change, came together when local veterans lobbied for the new name. Private Earl Simmons Humanitarian Academy. At the dedication ceremony, a small elderly woman, Galena in her 90s, sat in the front row, clutching a photograph of a young soldier holding a baseball bat beside a grinning boy. She was helped to the podium. "The last thing he ever said to me," she told the students gathered before her, "was that kindness doesn't need a reason, and that it only costs you what you're willing to give." She looked out at the rows of faces. Give much. That same year in Austria, students at the Salzburg Primary School wrote an end-of-term play about their city's history. The teacher had given them several topics to choose from: Mozart, the salt mines, post-war reconstruction. They voted instead to perform The Winter of Warmth. Their play featured children wrapped in blankets made of paper, American GIs with cardboard rifles offering bread, a painted tree with bronze leaves at center stage. At the final scene, one of the student actors, a girl playing Galena, walked forward holding a loaf of bread and whispered the line, "I thought I was invisible, but someone saw me and brought me back." The applause was thunderous. The teacher wept in the wings. By 2020, the last of the original refugees who had passed through the Salzburg Center were few and far between. Letters came in slower, photographs faded, names blurred. But still someone, somewhere, kept placing small stones at the base of the memorial tree in Salzburg. One stone had a date, one had the name of a child, one simply said thank you. And on the 50th anniversary of Colonel Franklin's death, a group of American veterans, none of whom had ever served in Europe, placed a replica plaque at the base of the tree. It read, "For those who refused to turn away. For those who fed strangers. For those who shared laughter in the dark." One final story. In 2023, a group of high school students in Krakow were assigned a project on World War II refugees. One student, a boy whose grandparents had been displaced from Ukraine during the war, found a scanned copy of Anatoly's diary online. He read it cover to cover, then reread it. He printed it out. Gave a presentation that ended with no slides, no music, no summary. He just read one passage. "We were not numbers. We were not ghosts. We were not political pawns. We were cold, and hungry, and tired. And someone saw us. And someone gave us bread." The room was quiet. The teacher, who had herself fled war once, long ago, just nodded. The war ended. The bombs stopped falling. The camps were dismantled. The flags came down. But kindness persisted. It passed from hand to hand, from mother to son, from professor to student, from soldier to child. A loaf of bread, a wool blanket, a quiet joke in the dark. These were the weapons against the silence. These were the fires that stayed lit. These were the things that made the refugees believe, just for a moment, that humanity had not abandoned them. That someone still remembered. That someone still cared. That someone still, despite it all, chose to give.